Basilica, in the Roman Catholic and Greek Orthodox churches, a canonical title of honor given to church buildings that are distinguished either by their antiquity or by their role as international centers of worship because of their association with a major saint, an important historical event, or, in the Orthodox Church, a national patriarch. The title gives the Church certain privileges, principally the right to reserve its high altar for the Pope, a cardinal, or a patriarch, and special penitential privileges that remove the basilica from local geographical jurisdiction and give it international status. In architecture, basilica in its earliest usage designated any number of large roofed public buildings in ancient Rome and pre-Christian Italy, markets, courthouses, covered promenades, and meeting halls. Gradually, however, the word became limited to buildings of a more or less definite form, rectangular walled structures with an open hall extending from end to end, usually flanked by side aisles set off by colonnades, in large buildings often running entirely around the central area, and with a raised platform at one or both ends. During the 1st century BC, when basilicas were increasingly used for judicial purposes, the raised platform became enclosed by an apse, or semicircular half-domed protrusion of the end wall, to accommodate the magistrate. The foundations of a number of very large basilicas have been excavated at several sites in Italy. The most impressive remains, however, are those of a basilica begun by Emperor Maxentius in the early 4th century AD in Rome and finished by his successor, Constantine the Great. One type of smaller secular basilica had side aisles extending the length of the sides only and an apse at one end. It was this type that the early Christians adopted for their churches, possibly because similar halls in large private houses had been used for Christian worship before the religion was officially recognized by the Roman Emperor Constantine in 313. Constantine himself commissioned the construction of 3 enormous Christian basilicas in Rome, St. Peter's, S. Paolo Fuori le Mura, and S. Giovanni in late Reino. He added a new feature, the transept, a lateral aisle crossing the nave just before the apse, and thus created the cross-shaped plan that became standard for churches in Western Europe throughout the Middle Ages. In ancient Roman architecture, a basilica, Greek basilica, was a large public building with multiple functions that was typically built alongside the town's forum. The basilica was in the Latin West equivalent to a stoa in the Greek East. The building gave its name to the basilica architectural form. Originally, a basilica was an ancient Roman public building, where courts were held, as well as serving other official and public functions. Basilicas are typically rectangular buildings with a central nave flanked by 2 or more longitudinal aisles, with the roof at 2 levels, being higher in the center over the nave to admit a clerestory and lower over the side aisles. An apse at one end, or less frequently at both ends or on the side, usually contained the raised tribunal occupied by the Roman magistrates. The basilica was centrally located in every Roman town, usually adjacent to the forum and often opposite a temple in imperial-era forums. Basilicas were also built in private residences and imperial palaces and were known as palace basilicas. In late antiquity, church buildings were typically constructed either as martyria, or with a basilica's architectural plan. A number of monumental Christian basilicas were constructed during the latter reign of Constantine the Great. In the post-Nicene period, basilicas became a standard model for Christian spaces for congregational worship throughout the Mediterranean and Europe. From the early 4th century, Christian basilicas, along with their associated catacombs, were used for burial of the dead. By extension, the name was later applied to Christian churches that adopted the same basic plan. It continues to be used in an architectural sense to describe rectangular buildings with a central nave and aisles, and usually a raised platform at the end opposite the door. In Europe and the Americas, the basilica remained the most common architectural style for churches of all Christian denominations, though this building plan has become less dominant in buildings constructed since the late 20th century. The Catholic Church has come to use the term to refer to its especially historic churches, without reference to the architectural form. The first known basilica, the Basilica Portia in the Roman Forum, was constructed in 184 BC by Marcus Porcius Cato, the Elder. After the construction of Cato the Elder's basilica, the term came to be applied to any large covered hall, whether it was used for domestic purposes, was a commercial space, a military structure, or religious building. The plays of Plautus suggest that basilica buildings may have existed prior to Cato's building. The plays were composed between 210 and 184 BC and refer to a building that might be identified with the Atrium Regium. Another early example is the Basilica at Pompeii, late 2nd century BC. Inspiration may have come from prototypes like Athens' Stoa Basileus or the hypostyle hall on Delos, but the architectural form is most derived from the audience halls in the royal palaces of the Diadochi kingdoms of the Hellenistic period. These rooms were typically a high nave flanked by colonnades. These basilicas were rectangular, typically with central nave and aisles, usually with a slightly raised platform and an apse at each of the two ends, adorned with a statue perhaps of the emperor, while the entrances were from the long sides. The Roman basilica was a large public building where business or legal matters could be transacted. As early as the time of Augustus, a public basilica for transacting business had been part of any settlement that considered itself a city, used in the same way as the covered market houses of late medieval Northern Europe, where the meeting room, for lack of urban space, was set above the arcades. However, although their form was variable, basilicas often contained interior colonnades that divided the space, giving aisles or arcade spaces on one or both sides, with an apse at one end, or less often at each end, where the magistrates sat, often on a slightly raised dais. The central aisle, the nave, tended to be wider and taller than the flanking aisles, so that light could penetrate through the clerestory windows. In the late Republican era, basilicas were increasingly monumental. Julius Caesar replaced the Basilica Sempronia with his own Basilica Julia, dedicated in 46 BC, while the Basilica Aemilia was rebuilt around 54 BC in so spectacular a fashion that Pliny the Elder wrote that it was among the most beautiful buildings in the world. It was simultaneously renamed the Basilica Pauli. Thereafter until the 4th century AD, monumental basilicas were routinely constructed at Rome by both private citizens and the emperors. These basilicas were reception halls and grand spaces in which elite persons could impress guests and visitors, and could be attached to a large country villa or an urban domus. They were simpler and smaller than were civic basilicas, and can be identified by inscriptions or their position in the archaeological context. Domitian constructed a basilica on the Palatine Hill for his imperial residential complex around 92 AD, and a Palatine basilica was typical in imperial palaces throughout the imperial period. Long, rectangular basilicas with internal peristyle became a quintessential element of Roman urbanism, often forming the architectural background to the city forum and used for diverse purposes. Beginning with Cato in the early 2nd century BC, politicians of the Roman Republic competed with one another by building basilicas bearing their names in the Forum Romanum, the center of ancient Rome. Outside the city, basilicas symbolized the influence of Rome and became a ubiquitous fixture of Roman colonii of the late Republic from c. 100 BC. The earliest surviving basilica is the Basilica of Pompeii, built 120 BC. Basilicas were the administrative and commercial centers of major Roman settlements, the quintessential architectural expression of Roman administration. Adjoining it there were normally various offices and rooms housing the curia and a shrine for the tutela. Like Roman public baths, basilicas were commonly used as venues for the display of honorific statues and other sculptures, complementing the outdoor public spaces and thoroughfares. Beside the Basilica Portia on the Forum Romanum, the Basilica Aemilia was built in 179 BC, and the Basilica Sempronia in 169 BC. In the Republic, two types of basilica were built across Italy in the mid-2nd to early 1st centuries BC, either they were nearly square as at Fanum Fortunae, designed by Vitruvius, and Cosa, with a 3:4 width-length ratio, or else they were more rectangular, as Pompeii's Basilica, whose ratio is 3:7. The basilica at Ephesus is typical of the basilicas in the Roman East, which usually have a very elongated footprint and a ratio between 1:5 and 1:9, with open porticos facing the agora, the Hellenic Forum. This design was influenced by the existing tradition of long stoi in Hellenistic Asia. Provinces in the West lacked this tradition, and the basilicas the Romans commissioned there were more typically Italian, with the central nave divided from the side aisles by an internal colonnade in regular proportions. In the Catholic Church, a basilica is a church with special privileges. It is typically housed in a large and important building. This designation may be made by the Pope or may date from time immemorial. Basilica churches are distinguished for ceremonial purposes from other churches. The building does not need to be a basilica in the architectural sense. Basilicas are either major basilicas, of which there are 4, all in the Diocese of Rome, or minor basilicas, of which there were 1,810 worldwide as of 2019. The umbraculum is displayed in a basilica to the right side, i.e. the epistle side, of the altar to indicate that the church has been awarded the rank of a basilica. Basilicas are Catholic Church buildings that have a designation, conferring special privileges, given by the Pope. Basilicas are distinguished for ceremonial purposes from other churches. The building need not be a basilica in the architectural sense, a rectangular building with a central nave flanked by 2 or more longitudinal aisles. Basilicas are either major basilicas, of which there are 4, all in the Diocese of Rome, or minor basilicas, of which there were 1,810 worldwide as of 2019. Numerous basilicas are notable shrines, often even receiving significant pilgrimages, especially among the many that were built above a confessio or the burial place of a martyr, although this term now usually designates a space before the high altar that is sunk lower than the main floor level, as in the case in St. Peter's and St. John Lateran in Rome, and that offer more immediate access to the burial places below. Some Catholic basilicas are Catholic pilgrimage sites, receiving tens of millions of visitors per year. Churches designated as papal basilicas, in particular, possess a papal throne and a papal high altar, at which no one may celebrate Mass without the Pope's permission. Thank you for watching this video.